Welcome to the Spring Fever Garden Forums, where we connect you, the gardener, with the experts at North Dakota State University. My name is Tom Kolb. I'm an extension horticulturist in the Department of Plant Sciences. This is the first of our 4 Spring Fever Garden Forums for this year, and our theme is Bucks and Blooms. Now, the format that we will be using tonight is the same format that we always use. We'll start with a 20-minute presentation, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. And we really do invite your participation in the forums. So let's get started. And today we're going to talk about saving some money. So over the last several years, prices have increased on nearly everything, including gardening expenses. Here to show us how to save money at garden centers is Don Kinzler. Don's a native of Lisbon, North Dakota. He writes weekly gardening columns that appear in the Forum Communications newspaper, and he hosts numerous radio programs during the growing season. Don has a weekly podcast called Growing Together. Don is the NDSU Extension Agent for Cass County. Don, welcome to the forums.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm excited to talk about ways that we can save money at the garden center. And the story actually begins about 40 years ago in the mid-1980s when my wife and I had our own garden center. So it's been a privilege to be on both sides of the garden center cash register. So as we begin thinking about saving money at a garden center, it's important for us to realize that there are basically 2 different types of garden centers. One are the national chain stores, the big box stores that sell lumber and appliances, and they maybe also have a garden center along with it. So there are the national chains, but also there are the locally owned garden centers, the independents. And the independent garden centers are ones that perhaps have specially tailored the plants to the growing area in which you're purchasing. So the independent garden centers, sometimes the prices might be a little higher than the national chains, but that material that has been produced there for you, oftentimes it's grown right there in their greenhouses. So oftentimes, even though the price might be a little higher, sometimes it's still a better value. And of course, it's also a great experience shopping at a locally owned garden center, walking into that greenhouse and getting the aroma, the humidity of where things are actually grown. All right, our money saving starts before we actually go to the garden center. We should make a plan as to the areas that you want to fill with plants and make a list, just like when we go to the grocery store. If we have a list of what we want to buy and need, we're less apt to do impulse buying, so that we fit our plants into our budget. The other thing that really does help is to line your trunk with either plastic or maybe boxes in which you can set pots of plants or totes. That really simplifies cleaning up the trunk afterwards. Now, I know many of us gardeners still have last year's kind of dirt residue in our trunks, but it does save time cleaning out that trunk if we've first lined it. And of course, time is money, so we're all about saving time. The other thing to do before we go that really saves money is to write down measurements, especially on things like the containers. Now, I always think when I go to the garden center that I'm going to remember what that pot size was, but usually I don't. And the importance of writing down the diameter of that pot, that will tell us how many plants are needed in that pot. And if we don't overbuy, then we're going to be saving money. Similar is true on areas that we want to landscape. If we write down the length and the width of the area, then we'll be able to fit the appropriate number of shrubs into that area so we purchase just the right amount. Similar is true with perennial or annual flower beds. If we write down the length and the width, then we can figure out when we're at the garden center exactly how many plants we need. I like to take along the tape measure so that, for example, with containers, I can kind of stretch out that tape measure and say, oh yeah, okay, the 18-inch diameter container, I need about this number of plants for that. Now, the best days of the week to shop are really Monday through Thursday because the weekends in May and early June are really, really busy. And so, if we would like to get a little bit of individual attention, or if we have questions as to how appropriately to fit our plants into our area, if Monday through Thursday, the garden center staff will usually have a little more time. On the weekends, they're really, really busy. Okay, when can we start buying? Uh, I never trust an early spring because the last thing we want to do is purchase plants early when it looks like spring is coming, but then to be fooled and have the things we planted freeze. And so I like to think about the time period between about May 15th to the 25th, kind of that 10-day period. I like to think about that as my favorite window for planting out frost-sensitive plants. Maybe even go towards the end of May. When the soil is nice and warm, the plants that we set out, that we transplant out, are going to take off better. So at the end of the program, I'm going to talk about what to do if you get the itch to buy early, what to do with those plants. So when we arrive at the garden center, a couple of things that we should kind of scope out. We should notice where the annuals and the perennials are so that we're sure that if we want a perennial, we're actually buying something that's going to come back every year, and make sure that we don't pick up an annual by mistake thinking it's a perennial. Also, we want to get the most out of our money by planting plants in their preferred sun or shade location. So in most cases, most garden centers will have the shade plants located under a shade cloth or other protection. So that's where we'd go to shop for our shade plants. Locate where where the trays or boxes are located, and also look where the prices are. Sometimes all the prices might be listed on a single kind of a poster somewhere rather than individual. And it's kind of embarrassing to get up to the cash register and find that we've kind of overspent our budget. All right, let's take a look at some ways that we can look for plants, the best plants, so we're getting the most for our money. Let's start with annual flowers. Look for plants that are well branched. As you see here, that pack of petunias is well branched, stocky at the base. They're not leggy. That geranium is really nice and full all the way. Don't concentrate on the flowers at this point. Look at the plant structures. Those flowers are going to come and go quickly, but it's that structure of the plant that is going to give us the most for our money, and rich green foliage. Now, when picking up plants for a container, if you pick up enough plants so that it immediately looks full, well, we've done it wrong. Those plants and containers need room to develop. And if we immediately crowd it so it looks full right away, they're not going to have enough room to grow and spread and develop, and they'll go downhill and get crowded. Plus, we've spent more money than we need. So we know we're done it right if there's some space. If it doesn't look full right away, then we've done it right. Similar with an annual flower bed. Look at the spacing on the tag and use that spacing. Maybe even stretch it a little bit. Now, an annual flower bed, when you just plant it, it's going to look a little sparse, but that's okay. They're going to develop. They'll have their space. If it immediately looks all full, again, we've kind of done it wrong. We haven't allowed space. Next, let's talk about choosing perennials so that we get the most for our money there. Look for perennials that are well branched, multiple shoots at the base, and the bloom is optional. In fact, I'd rather buy a perennial that does not have a bloom. The tag will tell what color it is usually. And so perennials take a season or two to develop, and that flower will detract and divert energy away from plant formation. So if I'm buying a perennial that has a flower on it, I'll usually cut it off once I get it home. So instead, look for a good structure. Now, when choosing perennials for the perennial bed, ways to make your money stretch is to look for and understand that some perennials are long-lived. And so for your money, these are going to be perennials that are with us for decades, maybe even a century, like peonies and daylilies, iris, hosta, bleeding heart. Those are going to give you many decades for the money that you invest. Other perennials, kind of another class of perennials, are shorter lived. They're still worth buying and worth planting, but they don't tend to last as long as many years in the perennial bed. Those are things like lupins, delphiniums, echinacea, certainly worth planting, but be aware that they might not live quite as long. Now, buying perennials such as this one that have more than one shoots coming out of the crown, we can immediately divide that. For example, this perennial, I can take a sharp butcher knife and I can slice right down there. I think I can get probably 3 plants for the price of 1 on that. And of course, saving money at the garden center isn't all about getting plants on the cheap, but if I save a little money here, I can spend it on an apple tree at the garden center. So carefully divide so that we don't, we don't want to disrupt them enough to lose the plants, but we can oftentimes divide. Now let's talk about vegetable plants, getting the most for your money. So look for rich green foliage. Avoid plants such as the lower photo that is quite yellowish. It's lacking nutrition. It'll come out of it with fertility probably, but why not start with good green, husky, well-branched plants and without flowers? If a tomato plant, a young little tomato plant has a flower, it's probably better to remove it so that the plant has a chance to root and develop its structure before prematurely developing flowers on it. Now, choosing shrubs, look for something well-branched and, of course, healthy foliage. And very important, remember the footprint of that plant, the width of it, so that the spot that you're buying the plant for is going to be filled by that plant. So we avoid buying a plant that would be a mistake because it didn't fit into that area. And of course, we've all done this. Those evergreens looked so cute when they were tiny. So make sure that we space the plants appropriately so we're not investing in something that down the road should have been spaced differently. Next, we talk about shade and ornamental trees. Of course, look for ones that have a good straight trunk, nice branching, and very important, notice the blue arrow here. Check to be sure that the root flare, also called the trunk flare, that's the part where the trunk widens out as it enters the soil. Very important that the tree was not planted too deeply into the pot, because if we took that tree home and planted it too deeply, that's a major cause of tree decline in the years to come. So again, we're saving money by planting that and observing that we're going to be able to plant that at the proper depth. Next, let's talk about choosing fruit trees so that we get good bang for our buck. Be certain that the cultivar is winter hardy for our zone so that we don't plant something that doesn't make it. So again, check the winter hardiness zone for your area. Branches well spaced along the straight trunk, and the wider the branch angles, the stronger the structure of that tree, and they're actually going to probably bear a little quicker for us. Some locally owned garden centers sell bare root trees versus potted trees. Bare root trees take off beautifully, and also you can spread out the roots to avoid the circling roots that are oftentimes a problem in potted trees. Potted trees work well too if we're certain to eliminate any circling roots. But check for bare root trees. They're good prices. Next, let's talk about the sizes of plants that we start with. Now, plant pots are oftentimes in terms of, at the far left, you see quartz. Many perennials are sold in quart containers. And then in trees and shrubs, we have 1 gallon size, 2 gallon. Many trees are in 10, 25 gallon. We can save money by starting with smaller starter plants. For example, here, the 1 gallon shrub of the same type is going to become the same thing that 15-gallon one is. Gardening is all about patience, and we can save a lot of money just by starting with a smaller plant. For example, these 2 daylilies are the same variety. They're going to end up doing the same exact thing, but the smaller size is certainly less price than the larger type. Now, some money-saving tips for the new homeowners. Plant the trees first, get them established because they cost more money, and then we can landscape with shrubs and perennials. In the meantime, use some annual flowers to fill in. Here's a money-saving tip at the garden center for weed control in lawns. Since most of our lawns are not a solid carpet of weeds, we don't need to carpet the lawn with a weed and feed type product. Instead, simply spot treat the weeds. We've saved quite a bit of money there on the expensive weed and feed. A little bit about garden center etiquette so that we're all getting a good product for our price. Make sure you put the tag back. If you've examined the tag, make sure you put it back in the right tag so that the next person is getting the product that they thought. And if you pick up a plant, put it carefully back down in its place so that the next person that comes along to buy won't get a plant with broken branches on it. All right. And lastly here, when you get your plants home, common question that we used to get in the garden center is people said, well, I want to buy these now while the selection is good, but I'm not ready to plant for a week or two. Is it okay to leave these in the garage? And the answer is no. Because these garden center plants were developed and grown in good light, high light, in greenhouses. And if we set them in the garage for a week or two, they're probably going to languish and go downhill under low light. Instead, make sure you water them. Don't let them wilt down, but use this time to harden off those plants. Don't keep them in the garage. Put them outside where they get sun and air. It'll harden them off, toughen them up, and then when you're ready to plant, there'll be less transplant shock on those. And I like to remove the flowers of some of these, especially perennials. I'll nip off the flowers so that more strength and energy will go into developing that plant. And of course, one of the biggest money-saving tips is to keep the tags and receipts in a journal. Because if a garden center does have a guarantee, you should save the slip, save the receipt. And also, it's important to know the identity in future years of perennials and trees and shrubs and fruit trees. So keep the tags and receipts in a journal. And probably the best money-saving tip of all is to, at the garden center, enjoy the experience. And isn't it going to be wonderful to go into that garden center again in the springtime and enjoy the experience? Always feel free to email me any questions, donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. And now, Tom, I can stop sharing if you'd like, and we could open it up for any questions.
Excellent, Don. And we invite your questions. If you want to slide your browser down to the bottom, that pop-up menu will come, and you can type your questions in the question and answer box. Here we go. Don, here's a question, a general question. Can you give us an example of what is a good branching pattern and a poor branching pattern?
Well, an example of a poor branching pattern is a few years ago, I bought an apple tree at a mass merchandiser because the price was really cheap. And so I bought it. I also bought another variety that I wanted at locally owned garden center. 5 years later, the cheaper apple tree had branches that were not spaced well. You can tell it maybe hadn't been pruned well. And so the poor branch habit, the branches were spaced too close. I probably should have pruned them away. The better apple tree from the locally owned garden center had already had the branches pruned and spaced. And also the tree that had the poorer branch habit did not have branches nicely spaced all around. It had maybe been grown at a wholesale garden center less expensively. Maybe they were crowded. The branches didn't develop all the way around. So a properly spaced fruit tree, properly grown fruit tree or shade tree will have branches that radiate out in all directions, kind of in a circular pattern. Did that explain?
I'm with you, Don. Let's here go with another question. When is give or buy soil at a garden center?
Soil at a garden center. What I like to do is lift the bag. And if the bag is really, really heavy, it's oftentimes a poorer quality mix that doesn't have as much good peat moss, vermiculite, perlite, coconut coir. Sometimes they're lighter materials. And so sometimes you do get what you pay for. Some of the good quality potting mixes are more expensive, but that's okay. And also, I like to ask the garden center, what type would you recommend? There are national brands certainly of potting mix, but oftentimes the greenhouse will have that same or similar mix that they use in their greenhouse for growing their plants. And of course, they use the good stuff because they want their plants to grow well. So some of the leading national brands are very good. But I check the bag originally if it's too just kind of soggy and heavy. And if the price is cheap, then I kind of figure I'm kind of getting what I'm paying for. And so I opt for something of better quality.
Don, if you had a raised bed and the raised bed is lacking some soil and you want to top it off, would you use topsoil or would you be inclined to go with a higher quality potting soil?
Well, the very best field soil or garden type soil, once you get it into a raised bed or a container, seems to just pack too hard. But also, the mixes that are sold for raised gardens seem to be almost the other extreme. They're almost too light and dry out too much. A good recommendation seems to be to combine the raised bed mixes, the bagged mix, with a good, preferably a loamy type of garden soil. And so not to use exclusively either one, but do kind of a hybrid. And we don't need to replace raised garden soil every year. When a person starts it off well and good, a good mix, then that will last for years. And of course, soil testing is important too, especially on a raised bed.
Don, another soil question. Let's say this person says they have a so-called bad soil. Do you have a particular soil amendment that you generally recommend?
Soil test, of course, always gives a good kind of a benchmark as to the nutrition and the organic component and things. So it kind of depends. Organic matter is always a good material to add because it takes sandy soil and gives it some water holding component and some nutrient holding component. And organic matter will take a heavy clay soil and kind of mellow and modify it a bit so that roots and air can grow better out.
So a good source of organic
So
matter
organic
would be
matter is probably right.
like compost or peat moss, for example.
Exactly. Compost, peat moss, manure, well rotted, if you're sure that the origin of that isn't from something that has a herbicide contaminant.
You know, you're talking about selecting the right number of plants for the size of the pot. Is there any type of ratio or got a formula in here? Is it all just in your
Yes,
wisdom down over the years?
it's interesting. The and For a webinar I did, I kind of tried to look up to see if there's a ballpark figure. But the problem with trying to find a rule of thumb, for example, for an 18-inch container, do you put three in? Do you put five in? But it depends on the type of plant that you put in. For example, a sweet potato vine is going to get massive versus a lobelia Both are going to trail over, but the lobelia is going to be much more moderate in size. So it kind of depends on the plants that you're going to put in. So that's where a garden center employee can help if you don't have experience with a plant. But experience is a great teacher. And so once you kind of discover, oh, wow, I planted a sweet potato vine for the first time and it took over my whole container. I wished I would have planted less. So sometimes taking notes, a garden journal will help with that experience as to how many plants, but it does depend on the type of plant. For example, super petunia can consume a great deal of material, space
Yeah.
in a plant.
How about Don? If I want to buy a fruit tree, well, if I go to a local garden center, is it more likely that I'm going to get a hardy plant compared to a big box store?
Usually, the locally owned garden centers, one of their key strong points is that they will usually monitor the varieties that are best adapted for that area. Sometimes the national chains will the person that orders for the national chains might be located elsewhere, and they might not always be as well tuned in to the plant material that grows best in our area.
You know, Don, I was kind of surprised when I moved here to North Dakota and I go to a big box store and they would even put on some of the fruit trees that this variety is not hardy for North Dakota. And, I'm right there at the Bismarck Garden Center and there's a label from the North Dakota Department of Ag. It says, this is not hardy for North Dakota. So I go, wow,
The
that was
the North
interesting.
Dakota the North Dakota Department of Agriculture is absolutely our gardening friend because there is a legal list of non-hardy woody plants for North Dakota, and anything that the inspector, our good friend Charles Elhard, anything that is on that list when he does his nursery inspections, anything that is on that list has to be tagged non-hardy for North Dakota. So our Department of Agriculture is protecting us.
Okay, Don, we got a real frugal person here. They want to save money on their soil in their containers. Can I mix in a non-soil product? I'll just draw styrofoam peanuts or something like that to fill up that container and save money? Or
Well,
what do you think about that?
yeah, some of the very tall, vertical containers take a lot of potting mix, and there's nothing wrong with packing peanuts way down in, or old pop cans or something to take up some space. But I really think a container should have at least 18 inches of soil. So unless it's one of the really big tall ones, I wouldn't add things in the bottom. But if it's huge, you can take up some space. But I think plants need at least, I think, 18 inches of soil, even in those tall ones. Can potting soil be reused in the outdoor planters? Mary and I have used some of the same potting mix for years. But here's a couple of things. Start with the high quality mix. Okay. And then each year, maybe take out a fourth or so of the mix, stick that down the bottom of another container, and blend in about maybe a fourth of a good high quality mix. Watch your fertility because many of the high quality mixes have little fertilizer slow release beads, and that's going to be gone after growing season. So make sure that you're fertilizing and feeding. And in the fall of the year, make sure you get all plant residue out of that. Pull out the plants, get rid of the leaves so you don't have disease carryover. If you do have any diseases that affected those plants, I would not reuse that soil.
Okay, Don, we're trying to save money on our tomato plants, and they got a special bargain now on the thin and yellow scraggly ones in the corner. Can I buy those and just cut the top off of them and
I wouldn't
nurture
cut,
them?
yeah, I would not cut the top off. The yellow part, if we give it a good, well-balanced, water-soluble fertilizer, they'll usually come out of that. But instead of taking the top off, the wonderful thing about tomatoes is we can plant them deeply. So remove the lower leaves, anything that would be below soil level, and the leaves that might touch the soil, remove those and plant it very deeply. The wonderful thing about tomatoes is they will root all along that buried stem. So either bury it vertically, or you can even lay them in a trench. But remember what direction you laid that down in a trench, so when you come to hoe the weeds, you don't pull out the plant that you buried.
Yeah, I like planting them in a trench, Don, because the soil will be warmer up there near the top.
Exactly. Yep. If you plant them too deeply, of course, the soil's chillier the deeper you go.
Listen, Don, I don't want to buy any ugly, straggly yellow tomatoes. Come on, we gotta invest something. It's like if you start with problems, I mean, probably got like disease. Like when I buy plants, like sometimes I lift up the plant a little bit out of the cell pack to see what the roots look like.
Well,
Make sure
and I don't want to mention lifting the plants out of the pots
I know it's
because garden
evil.
centers frown on that. But if you did, if you lift the plants out of the little cell pack, look for nice white roots as opposed to brown roots that are already starting to go downhill and maybe even starting to rot. So, yeah, big proponent of starting with good, healthy plants,
That's
both
right.
the tops and the roots.
I always make sure the garden center people aren't watching me when I do that. Just a little bit. How
Oh,
about
we used to love customers like you,
I
Tom.
know I was
But as
evil.
long as you put them back where you found them, put them back down in the pot, we were fine.
That's right. And I like your line about putting the labels back. There's nothing worse than people who don't put the label back.
Well, for
You,
example, if a tomato pack has two labels in, one an
yeah.
early tomato, one a late tomato, well, which is it? And so it essentially then it's a loss to the garden center because you can't just guess which it was.
Oh, then the other pet peeve I have is people who would mix them up. They say, okay, I really don't need four big boy tomatoes. I'll just take two big boys and I'll take some celebrities out and I'll mix them up. And
Well, we actually, because of that, we started selling a triplex, a little three pack with one early, one mid-season, one
oh,
late.
there you go. Okay.
Because we
Oh,
were getting customers like you, Tom, that would mix them up.
no, I would never do that. Come on, man. I wouldn't do that. Now, how about garden tools? Okay, I just spent a lot of money on my garden tools. How can I maintain them so that they last a long time?
I didn't cover garden tools, but yes, you get what you pay for. Buy the good stuff right away because it'll keep a good sharp edge, and you'll have them for decades. What I like to do is rub the wooden handles with a mixture of linseed oil and turpentine, half and half. That keeps the handles in good shape for years. And then also, when you're done weeding or using that product, oil the metal parts so that they don't begin to rust. Scrape off any dirt first. A high quality tool will last for decades and decades,
How
especially a
about
good hoe,
yes?
a weeding type hoe.
When I buy a potted tree, how aggressive can I be with those circular roots to make sure that they don't start girdling the plant? Like how
Well,
can I
I
break up the
remember.
roots?
Yeah, I remember when I was first kind of learning in horticulture, the recommendation was don't disturb those roots because you disturb them. And then we were finding decades later that those circling roots kept going circling, and 15 years later, the trees would topple over because the roots never went out. So the recommendations, of course, from our foresters are to tease those roots apart. Take the tree out of the pot, tease those roots apart, or even cut them maybe in four places, cut the bottom, but get those roots so they are not circling because they'll continue to circle otherwise like a boa constrictor and never go outward. So how aggressive? It's probably important to be fairly aggressive, but then after you've done that operation, get it in the planting hole, water it well so that the roots are not exposed to air any longer than necessary.
You mentioned soil testing. Do you have any recommendations on how to get your soil tested in a economical way?
NDSU no longer does soil testing. University of Minnesota does, and the soil test isn't high in cost. And I believe also Ag Vice in North Dakota.
Uh, the as a frugal gardener, A lot of cities offer free compost. What do you think about that?
Well, for example, in Fargo, the original source that goes into that compost is primarily lawn grass clippings, and some of those lawn grass clippings had herbicides sprayed on, and some of the herbicides are very persistent and long lasting, and they don't decompose as quickly as the compost does. And so when some of that compost is used then on our vegetable gardens, for example, tomatoes and others very sensitive plants, or maybe all the vegetable plants, could show damage from that herbicide. So when a person is getting municipal compost, you're not always certain of the safety of that because of the herbicide residual possibility. And so, taking that and doing some testing of it. But again, if you've got a pickup load of it, so I guess I always mention, buyer beware, even though it might be free. I think we need to beware of city compost.
Out here in Bismarck, I echo that. And even a Bismarck city will tell you buyer beware. Well, actually, you're not even a buyer. You're just picking it up pretty much for free, but it's quite risky. And it could have years of impact if there's toxins in that soil. Don, I want you to emphasize again, I've gotten a lot of questions about containers and soil. Can I reuse that soil in a container, or like how do you take out 1/4 of it partially and then mix it up with some fresh stuff every year? How do you handle
Yes,
that again?
when a person starts with when you first start with a new container, if you go for high quality potting mix and high quality, lots of good peat moss, coconut coir, a good drainage type material, so a good national brand or the one the garden center recommends. So start with the good stuff. And then at the fall of the year, make sure you take out any plant debris, all the old leaves and everything. And we've used the same potting mix probably 7, 8 years. But each spring, then take out at least 1/4 of it, blend in some good new material, use that fourth you took out, maybe in the bottom of another pot, and that seems to work quite well. But that potting mix is probably going to have the reused potting mix is going to be probably fairly low in nutrition. So make sure that with annual flowers, for example, that you're fertilizing with water soluble every 1 to 2 weeks, or that you're adding a slow release fertilizer back into that because nutrition will be a factor. The previous year's plants have taken most of the fertility out of that soil.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question on soil here, and specifically about peat. Are there different types of peat sold at garden centers, or is it all sphagnum peat moss, or what is
There
it?
are there are the bales, the compressed bales
Right.
of peat moss, for example, the Canadian sphagnum peat moss. Also, some garden centers, especially in Minnesota, have peat that comes out of local Minnesota bogs. That peat seems to be less fibrous, almost more like a composty type peat. I believe both are good organic type materials.
Okay, Don. You guys, I think there's so many questions. I knew Don was going to stimulate a lot of questions. He always does, and because he's just like a encyclopedia of knowledge there. And also, there was a lot of questions that had to do with general gardening practices, not so many, but I covered all. I think I covered almost all of them that had to do with saving money. So again, we want to stay on time. And if anybody has any questions that weren't answered, they can please send me an email or contact Don or contact your local county agent, and they'll be happy to help you.